When my daughter-in-law laughed at me in the school hallway, I smiled instead of crying. I was holding a children's book in my hands. My hands were steady, but my heart was not. The classroom door was open. I could hear soft voices inside. Small chairs, bright drawings on the walls. It smelled like crayons and clean floors. She looked at another mother and said quietly, "She just likes little stories." They both smiled. I lowered my eyes for a moment. If only she knew. The book I was holding was not just a story. Hello, my dear friends. Thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoy quiet, real stories like this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know. Now, let me tell you something about myself. Before I became just grandma, I was a woman who loved words. I wrote late at night, when the house was silent. I wrote at the kitchen table with a cup of tea beside me. Most people never knew, and maybe that was my mistake. When I think about my son as a little boy, I still see his small hands wrapped around my finger. He was quiet as a child, thoughtful, the kind of boy who would sit beside me while I wrote and ask, "What are you making today, Mama?" I would smile and tell him. A small world made of words. He did not always understand, but he always listened. Back then, our home felt warm. Not perfect, but warm. His father worked long hours. I worked too. I wrote in the evenings and took care of the house during the day. It was a busy life, but it was full. I believed love was enough to build a family that would always stay close. When my son grew older, he became more serious. He studied hard. He wanted a stable job, a steady income, something solid. Writing to him was something gentle, something uncertain. He once told me kindly, "Mama, you work so hard for something that does not always pay." I laughed and said, "Not everything that feeds you is money." He smiled politely, but I knew he did not fully understand. Still, he respected me, and that was enough. Years passed quietly. My books slowly found their way into libraries and schools. My name appeared on covers. Letters came from children. But at home, I was still just his mother. And I liked it that way. When he told me he had met someone, I saw light in his eyes that I had not seen before. Her name was Emily. She was confident, well-dressed, always organized. The first time she came to our house, she brought flowers, white lilies. She looked around the living room carefully, not judging, just observing. I offered her tea. She said yes, but asked if I had almond milk. I smiled and said no. She said that was fine. It was a small thing, but I remember it. They sat close together on the couch, whispering, laughing, planning. I watched them and felt two things at the same time: happiness and a small, quiet fear. Because when children fall in love, mothers must step back, and stepping back is not always easy. Their wedding was simple but beautiful. She wore a soft ivory dress. My son looked proud. I stood in the second row of chairs and clapped with everyone else. I told myself, this is how life moves forward. After the wedding, they bought a house. It was modern, clean lines, open spaces, very different from the cozy home I had raised my son in. When they asked me to move in with them a few years later, I felt grateful. My husband had passed by then. The house felt too quiet without him. So I packed my books, my notebooks, my old letters. I left behind furniture, but I brought memories. They gave me a room at the end of the hallway. "It's small," Emily said, "but it's peaceful." I nodded. It was small, but I told myself I did not need much space. I placed my books carefully on the shelves. I sat, my writing notebook on the desk near the window. The window faced a backyard. There was a swing there. When my grandson was born, everything changed again. The house filled with baby cries, soft blankets, tiny socks. I held him in my arms and felt something deep settle inside me. This was a new chapter. I whispered stories to him while rocking him to sleep, stories no one else heard. Emily returned to work after some months. She was focused, driven, always moving. I helped with the baby when I could, but I was careful, very careful. I did not want to overstep. Modern mothers have their own ways, their own rules. I respected that. If she said the baby needed a strict schedule, I followed it. If she said no sugar, I agreed. If she corrected the way I held him, I adjusted my arms quietly. Small things, always small things. At tea dinner, I tried to be helpful. I washed dishes. I folded laundry. Sometimes I cooked. But once, Emily tasted my soup and said gently, "It's a little salty." I apologized. After that, I used less salt. Over time, I noticed something else. When guests came over, Emily introduced me simply as, "This is my husband's mom." She never mentioned my writing. She never asked about it either. At first, I thought she simply did not know much about it. Then I realized she had never asked. My son did not bring it up either. Maybe they thought it was not important anymore. Maybe they believed that part of my life had ended. Sometimes when I sat at the dining table with my notebook, Emily would walk past and say, "Still writing?" Her tone was not cruel, just surprised. As if writing at my age was unusual, I would smile and say, "Just little thoughts." And I meant it. I did not write for fame anymore. I wrote because it was the only place I felt fully myself. But I began to do it more quietly. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, I did not want to seem foolish or outdated. There were moments when I tried to connect with Emily. I asked about her work. She worked in marketing, fast-paced, numbers and presentations. She explained it once. I listened carefully. I told her, "That sounds difficult. You must be very capable." She smiled politely, but there was always a thin wall between us, not made of anger, just distance. My grandson grew older. He loved books. That part made me happy. He would sit on the floor with picture books and ask me to read. Emily once said, "He loves stories. I don't know where he gets that from." I stayed quiet. I knew where he got it from, but I did not need credit. I only needed peace. Over time, I noticed how space in the house shifted. My books were moved once to make room for decorations. My writing desk was pushed closer to the wall. My old framed newspaper clipping was taken down during repainting. It never went back up. I told myself these things did not matter. A home belongs to the young ones now. I had my time, yet sometimes, late at night, I would sit by my window and feel smaller than I used to feel. Not unloved, just reduced, like a story placed on the wrong shelf. My son remained kind, but busy. When tension appeared, he chose silence. Silence feels safe, but silence can also feel like abandonment. I do not blame him. Life is complicated when you stand between two women you love. Still, there were days I missed being seen. Not as a grandmother, not as an extra pair of hands, but as the woman I had once been, the woman who stayed awake until midnight finishing chapters, the woman who signed her first book copy with trembling fingers, the woman who believed words could change small hearts inside me. She still existed. She had simply grown quiet, and I allowed her to stay quiet because I thought that was what love required. To shrink a little, to make space for others. I told myself this was maturity. This was grace. This was family. I believed I had built something strong. I believed love was solid. I did not yet understand how fragile respect can be. And I did not yet know that soon, in a bright classroom filled with children, everything would shift, softly, without shouting, without anger, just truth. And sometimes, truth is louder than any argument. There was no single day when everything changed. It happened slowly, like dust settling on a shelf you forget to clean. At first, I did not notice it, or maybe I noticed, but I chose not to see. The small things began in the kitchen. I had always loved cooking, not in a fancy way, just simple meals, warm food, soup that carried comfort, rice that filled the house with soft steam. One afternoon, I made chicken stew the way my son liked it when he was little. I remembered how he used to dip bread into the sauce and smile. When Emily came home, she tasted it and paused. "It's good," she said, "but we don't really eat this kind of food anymore." Her voice was not sharp. It was light, casual. I nodded. "Oh," I said. "I didn't know." After that, I began asking before I cooked anything. "Is this okay? Does this fit your meal plan? Should I make something else?" Slowly, the kitchen stopped feeling like a place that belonged to me. Then there were the shelves. I kept my books in neat rows in the living room. Not all of them, just a few favorites, some classics, a few of my own copies. One weekend, while I was out walking, Emily reorganized the room. When I returned, the shelves looked clean and modern. Decorative boxes, framed quotes, a small plant. My books were gone. I found them stacked in a cardboard box in my room. There wasn't enough space, she explained. The living room needed a cleaner look. I smiled and said it was fine. But that night, I touched the covers gently before placing them on my smaller shelf. It felt like a quiet removal. Not cruel, just deliberate. Another time, I mentioned that one of my old publishers had emailed me. They want to reprint one of my early books. I said at dinner. Emily looked surprised. "Oh, I didn't know those were still around." She turned to my son. "Did you know your mom's books were still selling?" He shrugged. "I guess some people still like them." "Some people." I looked down at my plate. The conversation moved on to school schedules and weekend plans. I told myself not to feel hurt. It was not their world. It was mine. And maybe I had never invited them into it properly. But small dismissals began to gather like raindrops before a storm. One evening, I was reading to my grandson in the living room. He was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, eyes wide. I changed my voice for different characters. I slowed down at the emotional parts. He leaned closer. Emily walked in and watched for a moment. Then she laughed softly. "You're very dramatic," she said. "It's just a children's book." I smiled. "Yes," I replied, "but children feel deeply." She did not respond. Later that night, I heard her tell my son, "She takes stories too seriously." I pretended I had not heard. The next morning, I read more quietly. I removed the different voices. I kept it simple, less dramatic, less me. As months passed, I noticed something else. When guests visited, Emily often spoke about her work with pride, and she should. She worked hard, but when someone asked about me, she would say, "She helps around the house." That was all. No mention of writing. No mention of the awards tucked inside my drawer. No mention of the letters from teachers who once thanked me. Just help around the house. It felt like being reduced to a role instead of a person. Still, I remained calm, because anger would only create distance, and I did not want distance. I wanted peace. My grandson grew older. He started kindergarten. He loved coming home with drawings and small papers covered in bright letters. One day, he ran into my room. "Grandma, my teacher read us a book today." I smiled. "What was it about?" He said the title. It was mine. I froze for a moment. "Oh," I said softly. "Did you like it?" "Yes, the author is really good." I swallowed gently. "I'm glad you think so." He did not notice the way my hands trembled slightly. Later that evening, at dinner, he mentioned the book again. Emily said, "That's nice, honey." Then she turned to me. "You probably like that kind of thing." I looked at her. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." But I did not tell them. I do not know why. Maybe I was afraid they would think I was trying to impress them, or worse, that I was trying to compete. Another small moment came on a rainy afternoon. I was writing in my notebook by the window. Emily passed by and glanced at the page. "You're still doing that?" she asked. "Just thoughts," I replied. She hesitated. "You know, at this stage of life, you should relax more. Enjoy retirement." Retirement. The word felt heavy. As if my creative mind had an expiration date. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. Maybe you're right. After that, I began writing even later at night, when the house was fully silent, when no one could comment. It was easier that way, but something inside me was shrinking. Not my love for stories, that remained strong, but my willingness to let others see it. I became quieter at the dinner table. I spoke less about ideas. I stopped mentioning new projects. When the school sent a letter asking for volunteers to read during Literacy Week, I saw it on the kitchen counter. Bright paper, cheerful design. I picked it up and read it carefully. Parents and grandparents welcome. Read your favorite children's book. Share the joy of stories. My heart stirred gently. I imagined sitting in a small chair, children listening, sharing words once more, not as a mother, not as a helper, but as a storyteller. I placed the paper back on the counter. I told myself it was not necessary. But that night, I could not sleep. The thought returned again and again. Why not? Why not volunteer? It was a simple act, nothing dramatic, just reading. The next morning, I filled out the form quietly. I did not announce it. I simply placed it in my grandson's backpack. Days passed. I almost forgot about it until Emily found the confirmation email. She was standing in the kitchen with her phone in her hand. Did you sign up for this reading thing? She asked. Her tone was not angry, but it was sharp. Yes, I replied calmly. I thought it would be nice. She stared at me for a moment. You don't have to, she said. Parents usually do it. I am his grandmother, I said gently. That counts. She sighed softly. I just don't want it to be awkward. Awkward. The word stayed in the air between us. I will only read, I said. Nothing more. She looked uncertain. Well, just keep it simple. Keep it simple. As if I did not know how to read to children. As if I had not done it for decades. My son entered the room. What's going on? He asked. Your mom signed up to read at school, Emily said. He looked at me. Oh. He said, that's nice. Nice. No enthusiasm. No curiosity. Just polite approval. I smiled at both of them. It will only take 20 minutes, I said. But inside me, something had shifted. Not anger. Not rebellion. Just a quiet awareness. I realized then that in their eyes, I had already become smaller than I truly was, and perhaps I had allowed it. Perhaps I had hidden too much of myself. Perhaps love does not require shrinking. Perhaps it requires honesty. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept my awards and letters. I read one from a teacher who had written, Your stories change the way my students see themselves. I held it close for a moment, then I placed it back. I did not need applause. I did not need recognition at home, but I needed something else. I needed dignity, and maybe, just maybe, that classroom would give me a small piece of it back. Not through revenge, not through pride, but through truth. And so the small changes that had quietly reduced me were leading toward something unexpected. A simple reading day. A simple book. A simple moment. But sometimes the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths, and I could feel it coming. Softly. Like the first page turning before a new chapter begins. After the email confirmation arrived, the house felt slightly different. Not louder, not colder, just tighter. As if the walls were listening. Emily did not mention the reading day again for a few days, but I noticed small changes in her behavior. She checked the school calendar more often. She reminded my grandson about proper behavior in front of visitors. She asked him to sit straight at dinner. It was subtle, but it was there. One evening, while we were clearing the table, she finally spoke. You're still planning to go, right? Her tone was controlled. Yes, I said gently. Unless you prefer I don't. She paused, then she placed a plate into the sink with a little more force than necessary. It's not that, she said. I just don't want it to be. Uncomfortable. Uncomfortable for who? I asked quietly. She did not answer immediately. For everyone, she finally said. I dried my hands slowly. I will only read a story, I replied. She looked at me carefully. Please don't make it into something big, she said. It's just a small classroom thing. Her words were not cruel, but they carried something heavier beneath them. A fear, or maybe embarrassment. That night, I sat in my room and looked at the book I planned to bring. It was one of mine. A simple story about a shy child who finds her voice. It had been published years ago. The cover was bright and friendly. The words were gentle. I ran my fingers across my own name printed at the bottom. It still felt strange to see it there. I had never written for recognition. I wrote because stories felt alive inside me, but now, holding that book, I wondered if bringing it would seem arrogant. Would it make Emily uncomfortable? Would my son feel awkward in front of other parents? I closed the book and placed it back on the desk. For a moment, I considered choosing a different one. Something neutral. Something safe. The next day, my grandson came home excited. Grandma, my teacher said someone special is coming to read next week. I smiled. Oh. Yes, she said sometimes authors visit schools. My heart skipped softly. Did she? He nodded eagerly. I hope we get a real author one day. I swallowed gently. That would be nice, I said. Later that evening, Emily found me in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. I was thinking. She began. I waited. Maybe it would be better if I did the reading. Instead, her words were calm, but firm. I felt a quiet ache in my chest. Why? I asked softly. She sighed. You know how kids can be, and parents too. It's just, sometimes older people get nervous in front of a crowd. I looked at her carefully. I am not nervous, I said. She hesitated. It's just that things have changed, she continued. Reading styles are different now. Classrooms are different. I nodded slowly. I understand. She studied my face. You're not upset? She asked. No, I replied. I just want what's best for him. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I felt myself shrinking again, becoming smaller, more fragile in their eyes than I truly was. Later that night, I overheard a conversation between her and my son in the living room. She means well, Emily said. I know, my son replied. But what if she forgets something, or reads too slowly, or makes it awkward? She won't, my son said, but his voice lacked confidence. I just don't want the other parents to think. Emily's voice trailed off. To think what? My son asked quietly. That we didn't plan properly. There it was. Not fear of my failure, but fear of how it would look. I returned to my room without making a sound. I sat at my desk and stared at the blank wall. For a moment, I asked myself a difficult question. Why does this matter to me so much? It was only 20 minutes, only a small classroom, only a few children sitting on colorful mats. But deep inside, I knew it mattered because it was the first time in years that I had chosen something for myself. Not for convenience. Not to help. Not to adjust, but to simply be who I was. A storyteller. The next morning at breakfast, Emily cleared her throat. I talked to the teacher, she said casually. She said it's fine if you still want to come. I looked up. She did. Yes, but she said it should stay simple. Just reading, no extra discussion. I almost smiled. I asked if I would turn it into a lecture. I understand, I said. My son looked at me. Mom, if you feel uncomfortable at any point, just let us know, he said. I nodded. I will be fine. Days passed slowly. The closer we got to the reading day, the more I felt the tension. Emily ironed my grandson's clothes carefully the night before. She reminded him to sit politely. She even asked me what I planned to wear. Something simple. I replied, not too old-fashioned. She added quickly, I smiled gently. I'll try not to embarrass you. The words slipped out before I could stop them. She looked at me, startled. I didn't mean it like that. She said quickly, It's all right. I replied softly, I understand. But I wasn't sure she understood me. That night, I chose a soft blue sweater and a simple skirt. Nothing dramatic, nothing attention-seeking, just comfortable. I placed the book inside my bag. For a long moment, I considered removing it, replacing it with something safer. But then I thought about my grandson's bright eyes. I thought about the children who once wrote to me, and I left at their dot in the morning. The house felt quiet. Emily moved quickly around the kitchen. My son checked his watch more than usual. When it was time to leave, Emily picked up her car keys. I'll drive, she said. The ride to school was silent. My grandson hummed softly in the back seat. I watched the trees pass by through the window. I felt calm, strangely calm. As if something inside me had already made peace with whatever might happen. When we arrived, the school looked bright and welcoming. Children's artwork covered the hallway walls. Parents stood near the entrance chatting. Emily straightened her jacket. She glanced at me briefly. Remember, she said quietly, just keep it light. I nodded. I will. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed a few mothers looking at me with polite smiles. Emily leaned toward one of them. My mother-in-law is reading today, she said. The woman looked surprised. Oh, she replied, that's sweet, sweet. Such a gentle word. Such a small one. We stopped outside the classroom door. I could hear children laughing inside. The teacher stood near the entrance. Greeting parents, Emily introduced me quickly. This is my husband's mom, she said. The teacher smiled warmly. Thank you for volunteering, she said. I nodded. It's my pleasure. Emily leaned closer to another parent and whispered something. They both smiled. Softly, almost kindly. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. She was not laughing because she hated me. She was laughing because she underestimated me. She truly believed I was just an elderly woman who liked little stories, and maybe that was my fault, because I had allowed that image to exist. But soon, in just a few minutes, that image would change. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through something much simpler. Truth. I adjusted the book inside my bag. I felt its weight. Familiar. Steady. The teacher clapped her hands gently. All right, children, she said. We have a special guest today. I stepped forward. Emily stood near the back of the room, watching, and for a brief moment, I heard her whisper to another mother, she just likes reading little stories. I smiled, because soon they would learn something more. The classroom felt smaller than I remembered from years ago. The chairs were tiny, bright colors, red, blue, yellow. The walls were covered in drawings of animals and uneven letters. The air smelled like crayons and paper. Children sat cross-legged on a large rug in the center of the room. Their eyes were curious, open. The teacher smiled at me kindly. Class, this is Liam's grandmother, she said. She's here to read to us today. A few children waved. My grandson looked proud for a moment. Then he glanced toward his mother. Emily stood near the back of the room with two other parents. She smiled politely. I stepped forward slowly. The teacher handed me a small wooden chair. It looked fragile beneath me. I sat carefully. For a second, I felt my heart beat in my throat. Not fear, just awareness. Awareness that I had been unseen for a long time. And now, I was visible again. I placed my bag beside my feet. The children leaned forward. What book are you reading? One little girl asked. I smiled. A simple story, I replied. Simple. That word again. I opened my bag and took the book out slowly. The cover faced me at first. I traced the edge of it with my thumb. Years of memory lived inside those pages. Late nights, quiet mornings, letters from readers. But here, in this small room, it was just a book. I turned it outward so the children could see the cover, a colorful illustration of a shy little bird sitting alone on a fence. "Oh," a boy whispered. "I know that one," another child said softly. My heart paused. I looked up briefly. The teacher tilted her head. "You've seen this before?" she asked the class. "Yes." Several children answered together. "We have it in the reading corner." I swallowed gently. Emily shifted slightly in the back of the room. I could feel her watching. I kept my voice calm. "Well," I said softly, "let's read it again." I opened to the first page. For a moment, I did not read. I just looked at the words, familiar, like an old friend. Then I began. My voice was steady, slow, clear. I did not rush. I let the sentences breathe. The shy little bird did not know how to sing. The other birds were louder, brighter, braver. The children listened quietly. One little boy rested his chin in his hands. A girl hugged her knees and stared at the pictures. I glanced toward the back of the room for just a second. Emily was whispering something to another mother. They both smiled faintly. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with that same soft amusement. She just likes little stories. I could almost hear it again in my mind. For a brief moment, a small ache rose in my chest, not anger, just sadness. Because she truly believed that was all this was. Just an old woman enjoying a simple hobby. I returned my focus to the children. The bird in the story was afraid to sing in front of others, afraid of sounding wrong, afraid of being laughed at. I paused before turning the page. I let the silence sit in the room. The children leaned closer. "Why doesn't she just try?" a small voice asked. "Because sometimes trying feels scary." I replied gently. The teacher watched me more closely now. There was something different in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. I continued reading. I gave each character a slight change in tone. Not dramatic, just enough to make them alive. The shy bird met an older bird who encouraged her quietly. The older bird said, "Your voice is not small. It is just waiting." As I spoke that line, my own voice softened. The classroom grew very still. Even Emily stopped whispering. I could feel it. The shift. The children were not just hearing words, they were feeling them. And that is what stories are meant to do. About halfway through the book, the teacher stepped closer. She looked at the cover again. Then she looked at me. Her brows tightened slightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, not interrupting but curious. I paused and looked up. "Yes?" She leaned closer to see the author's name clearly. Her eyes widened just a little. She stepped back slowly. I pretended not to notice. I continued reading. The shy bird finally gathered the courage to sing. Her voice trembled at first. Other birds laughed, but she did not stop. She kept singing, and slowly, the laughter faded, because her voice was beautiful, simple, honest. A little girl in the front row wiped her eye quietly. I saw it, and my heart felt full. In that moment, I was not a grandmother trying to avoid embarrassment. I was exactly who I had always been, a storyteller. When I reached the final page, I closed the book gently. The room remained silent for a second. Then the children clapped, not wildly, but warmly, sincerely. My grandson looked at me differently now. His eyes were wide, proud. The teacher stepped forward. "Thank you," she said slowly. Her voice carried something else now. Respect. She turned the book over in her hands again. Then she looked at me directly. "May I ask, are you the same?" She stopped herself, glancing at the cover once more. I nodded gently. "Yes." A quiet breath left her lips. "Oh my goodness." Emily shifted again in the back of the room. I could sense confusion in her posture. The teacher faced the children. Class, she said carefully, did you know the person who wrote this book is sitting right in front of you? The room went completely still. Small faces turned from the teacher to me. My grandson blinked twice. What? He whispered. I smiled softly. Yes, I said. I wrote this story many years ago. There was no pride in my tone, just truth. A little boy raised his hand quickly. You're the author? Yes, I replied. The teacher covered her mouth gently. I had no idea, she said. We use your books in our reading program. I heard a small gasp from the back of the room. I did not look, but I knew it was Emily. The teacher continued speaking. Your stories are part of our literacy curriculum. Curriculum? Such a formal word for something that once lived in my kitchen at midnight. The children began whispering excitedly. My mom reads that one to me. We have the bird book at home. My grandson slowly stood up from his place on the rug. He looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. Grandma, he said quietly, you wrote this? Yes, I said. His mouth opened slightly. You're a real author? I smiled. I suppose so. There was no dramatic music and no grand announcement, just a simple revelation. Truth spoken gently. I finally allowed myself to glance toward the back of the room. Emily stood very still. Her face had changed. Not angry, not embarrassed, just stunned. The other mothers were looking at her now. Curious as if asking silently, you didn't know? The teacher turned back to me. Would you like to answer a few questions? She asked eagerly. I hesitated for a brief second. Then I nodded. Yes, I would be happy to. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. Not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. I was no longer the elderly woman who might embarrass her family. I was the author of the very book in their reading corner. And I had never needed to prove it. I had only needed to speak. The shy bird had finally sung, and the room was listening. When the teacher asked if I would answer a few questions, I felt something warm move through my chest. Not pride, not victory, just a quiet return to myself. The children were looking at me in a new way now. Their eyes were brighter, curious, almost amazed. I placed the book gently on my lap. Yes, I said softly. You may ask me anything. A small hand shot up immediately. How did you think of the bird? A little girl asked. I smiled at her. The bird came from a memory, I replied. When I was young, I was shy too. I did not always speak loudly, but I felt many things inside. The children nodded as if that made perfect sense. Another boy raised his hand. How long did it take you to write it? A long time, I said honestly. Sometimes stories take months, sometimes years. They grow slowly. The teacher stepped closer. Her voice carried excitement now. We actually read 3 of your books this year, she said. The children love them. I could hear soft murmurs across the rug. That one with the lost puppy, and the tree that talks. Each title felt like a memory returning home. I had written those stories in the quiet hours of my life, when the house was asleep, when my son was still small, when my husband would bring me tea and say, keep going. And now here they were, living in this bright classroom. The teacher looked at the back of the book again. She read my short biography aloud. Award-winning children's author, she began. Her voice slowed. She glanced at me with disbelief and respect. I heard a chair move softly behind the children. I knew Emily had shifted her weight. For a moment, I imagined what she must be thinking. How many times had she walked past my small writing desk? How many times had she seen my notebook and assumed it was just a hobby? I did not blame her. I had never insisted on being known. I had hidden that part of myself carefully. The teacher continued reading. Her books are used in schools across the country. A few parents in the back whispered to each other. One mother looked at Emily and said something quietly. Emily's lips parted slightly. She shook her head once, almost in disbelief. The children began clapping again, not because they understood awards, but because they sensed something special. My grandson slowly walked toward me. He did not sit back down. He stood near my chair and looked up at my face. "Grandma," he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was not accusing. It was tender. I bent slightly so I could meet his eyes. "I didn't want to make it about me," I said gently. "But you're famous," he said. The room laughed softly. I smiled. "No," I replied. "I am just someone who loves stories." The teacher asked if I would read another short passage. I agreed. This time, I did not hold back. I read with warmth, with rhythm, with the quiet confidence that had once guided me through book tours and school visits long ago. The children leaned forward again. Even the parents were silent now. The air felt different, heavier with attention, lighter with understanding. When I finished, the applause was stronger, not loud, but full, sincere. The teacher stepped beside me. "We are truly honored," she said. "This is such a gift for our class." Gift. That word touched me deeply, because for years I had felt like an extra piece in someone else's home. But here, in the small classroom, I was a gift. One of the mothers approached slowly. "I read your books to my daughter," she said quietly. They helped her when she was struggling in school. Her eyes were soft, grateful. I nodded gently. "Thank you for telling me," I replied. I noticed Emily still standing near the wall. She had not moved forward. She had not spoken. Her face was pale, thoughtful. The teacher invited the children to gather around me for a photo. They crowded gently at my knees, smiling, holding the book. My grandson pressed close to my side. As the photo was taken, I felt something shift inside him, a new understanding forming. When the children were dismissed for recess, the room slowly emptied. Parents lingered near the doorway. The teacher shook my hand firmly. "I would love to invite you back," she said, "perhaps for a writing workshop." I smiled. "That would be lovely." The other parents nodded in agreement. Emily finally stepped forward. Her steps were slow, measured. She stopped in front of me for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The noise of children running outside drifted through the open windows. She looked at the book in my hands, then at my face. "You never told us," she said quietly. Her voice was not angry. It was confused. I held her gaze gently. "You never asked," I replied. There was no accusation in my tone, only honesty. She swallowed. I didn't realize," she said. "I know," I answered. A long pause settled between us. My son had arrived near the door. He must have left work early when he heard what happened. He stood there silently, listening. He looked from me to Emily and back again. "Mom," he said softly, "is it true? Your books are used here?" "Yes," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know they were that big." I smiled faintly. They grew quietly. The teacher joined us again. "She's being modest," she said warmly. "Her books have been part of our curriculum for years." Curriculum. That word still felt strange. Emily lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was barely audible, but I heard it. And so did my son. I placed the book back into my bag slowly. "There is nothing to apologize for," I said gently, but there was something in her expression that told me she understood now, not just my success, but her assumptions. The drive home was quiet, different from the silence earlier that morning. The silence carried weight. My grandson could not stop talking. "My grandma is an author," he repeated again and again. My son glanced at me through the rearview mirror. There was pride in his eyes, but also regret. When we arrived home, Emily went straight to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a long time without speaking. I went to my room and placed the book carefully on my desk. I sat down slowly. The house felt the same. The walls were the same color. The shelves were still rearranged, my desk was still small, but something inside me was no longer small. A knock came at my door an hour later. It was my grandson. He rushed in and hugged me tightly. I'm going to tell everyone tomorrow, he said proudly. I held him close. Just tell them you love stories, I whispered. He nodded. Later that evening, my son came to my room alone. He sat on the edge of the chair near my desk. I should have paid more attention, he said quietly. I looked at him gently. You were busy building your own life, I replied. But still, he continued, I didn't realize how much you've done. I smiled. I didn't need you to realize it, I said softly. I just needed you to respect it. He lowered his eyes. I'm sorry, he said. I reached over and touched his hand. It's all right, I replied, because in that moment, I felt no bitterness, only clarity. The shy bird in my story had sung, and the world had listened, not because she shouted, but because she stayed true to her voice. That night, Emily did not speak much at dinner, but she did something small. She placed one of my books back on the living room shelf. Just one centered visible. It was not a grand gesture, but it was a beginning. I watched quietly from the hallway, and I understood something important. Sometimes, people do not see us clearly, not because they want to hurt us, but because we have allowed ourselves to fade. We think shrinking keeps the peace. We think silence is kindness, but silence can also erase us. When I opened that book in the classroom, I was not proving anything. I was simply being honest. And honesty has a quiet power. The next morning, sunlight entered my room softly. I sat at my desk again. But this time, I did not wait for midnight. I opened my notebook in the early hours, while the house was awake, while footsteps moved down the hallway. I wrote without hiding, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fully present in my own home, not larger than anyone else, not above them, just equal. Seen. The shy bird had found her voice, and so had I. Applause fades quickly. It echoes for a moment. Then it disappears into ordinary air. When we returned home from the school that afternoon, everything looked the same as it had that morning. The couch was in the same place, the kitchen counter still held a bowl of fruit. Sunlight came through the same window, but the silence felt different. It was not tense. It was thoughtful. My grandson ran ahead of us into the house. He dropped his backpack near the door. Grandma is an author, he shouted as if the walls needed to hear it too. My son gave a small smile. Emily said nothing. She placed her purse on the table and stood still for a moment. Then she slowly walked into the kitchen. I followed quietly, not to confront her, but simply because that is where I always went. She began rinsing a glass under running water, even though it was already clean. The sound of water filled the space between us. After a while, she turned it off. I feel foolish, she said without looking at me. Her voice was low, honest. I leaned gently against the counter. There is no need, I replied. She shook her head slightly. I laughed, she said. I actually laughed. There was no defense in her tone, only realization. I did not rush to comfort her. I let the silence sit for a few seconds. Then I spoke carefully. You laughed because you thought you understood me, I said softly. You were not trying to be cruel. She turned to face me then. But I was wrong, she said. Yes, I answered. Not harshly, just truthfully. Her shoulders dropped a little. I didn't know. She whispered again. I know, I said, and I meant it. Because I had hidden that part of my life for so long that it almost felt natural for others not to see it. Later that evening, my son came home from picking up groceries. He set the bags down on the counter and looked at me with a mixture of pride and confusion. I've been getting messages, he said. Messages? I asked gently. Other parents from school. They're asking if it's really true. I smiled faintly. And what did you tell them? That it is, he replied. He paused. I feel like I should have known more about your work. I shook my head softly. You knew enough, I said. You knew I loved writing, but I didn't know it mattered this much, he said quietly. I did not respond immediately, because that sentence carried something deeper. He did not know it mattered, and maybe that was the heart of everything. At dinner, the atmosphere was different. My grandson talked nonstop about the classroom. My friends couldn't believe it, he said. They kept asking if you signed books. I smiled. Did you tell them I just read stories? I teased gently. He laughed. No, I told them you made the stories. Emily watched us closely. There was a softness in her eyes that had not been there before. After dinner, she stood up quietly and walked toward the living room shelves. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She moved a decorative box aside. She adjusted a small plant. Then she picked up the single book she had placed there earlier and added two more from the box in my room. She arranged them carefully. Front dash facing visible. It was not a grand apology, but it was deliberate, and I noticed that night, as I sat at my desk, I did not feel hidden. The door to my room remained open. Footsteps passed by. Voices drifted from the living room. I continued writing. The sound of my pen on paper felt steady, certain. A while later, there was a soft knock. Emily stood at the doorway. May I come in? She asked. I nodded. She stepped inside slowly and looked around the room. The books. The letters in the drawers slightly open. The old framed newspaper clipping resting against the wall. I've never really looked in here, she admitted. That's all right, I replied gently. She walked closer to my desk. Why didn't you tell us? She asked again. I folded my hands. Because I didn't want my past to feel like pressure, I said. You have your own careers, your own paths. I didn't want to compete. She frowned slightly. Compete? With me? I smiled faintly. You're ambitious, strong, capable. I didn't want you to think I was trying to prove something. Her expression softened. I never thought of it that way, she said. I know, I replied. Another silence settled, but this one felt lighter. I think, she began slowly, maybe I felt insecure. I looked at her with surprise. Insecure? Yes, she said quietly. You always seemed so calm, so sure, and I thought writing was just a small hobby, something harmless. She swallowed. But today I realized it was much bigger than I imagined. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply listened. And I think, she continued, I laughed because I didn't want to feel small. Her honesty touched me deeply. None of us are small, I said gently. We're just different. She nodded. I'm sorry, she said again. This time, the apology felt complete. I reached for one of the books on my desk and handed it to her. Would you like to read it? I asked softly. She held it carefully, as if it were fragile. Yes, she replied. When she left the room, I felt a quiet peace settle inside me. Not triumph, not victory, just balance. In the following days, small changes continued. My grandson brought home a library slip and asked if I would sign his copy. I wrote a simple message inside the cover. Keep listening to your own voice. He hugged me tightly afterward. At tea breakfast, my son asked questions about my early writing years. How did you get your first book published? Did you ever get rejected? I answered honestly. Yes. Many times. We spoke longer than we had in months. Emily listened quietly. Sometimes she added a question of her own. What made you keep going? She asked one morning. I smiled. I believed the stories mattered, I said. She nodded thoughtfully. The house felt more open now, not because my name was known, but because my voice was no longer hidden. One afternoon, I found Emily sitting on the couch reading the Shy Bird story. She did not notice me at first. Her expression was focused, gentle. When she finished, she looked up and saw me standing there. It's beautiful, she said simply. I nodded. Thank you. I understand it better now, she added. Which part? I asked. The part about being afraid to sing, she said. I felt a small warmth rise in my chest. Yes, I replied softly. That part is important. She closed the book carefully. I don't want you to feel like you have to shrink here, she said quietly. I looked at her for a long moment. Neither do I answered, and that was enough. There was no dramatic family meeting. And no loud declarations. Just gradual understanding. The kind that grows slowly, like the stories I used to write. The applause in the classroom had faded, but something deeper had remained. Respect, recognition, not of fame, but of identity. I was still a grandmother, still part of this household, still folding laundry and washing dishes, but I was also something more. And now, they knew it. That evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, I sat at my desk again. The house was not silent this time. Television sounds drifted from the living room. My grandson's laughter echoed down the hallway. Emily's voice followed, warm and relaxed. I opened a new page in my notebook. The words came easily. Not rushed. Not hidden. Just steady. I wrote about a bird who finally understood that her voice had value. Not because others applauded, but because she chose to use it. And, as I finished the first paragraph, I realized something quietly important. The silence after applause is where truth lives, not in the clapping, not in the praise, but in what remains when the noise fades. And what remained for me was simple. I did not need to prove who I was, I only needed to stop hiding it. The house felt different after that day, not loud, not dramatic, just softer, like something heavy had finally been set down. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The sky outside my bedroom window was pale gray. The birds had not started singing yet. For a moment, I lay still and listened to the quiet. It felt peaceful. But underneath that peace, there was something else. A small ache, not sharp, not angry, just tender. Family wounds do not disappear overnight. They settle, they breathe, they wait to be healed slowly. I went to the kitchen and made tea. The house was still asleep. I liked those early hours. They gave me space to think without interruption. As I stirred the tea, I remembered the first time I ever held a copy of my own book in my hands. I was 32 years old. I had been working at night, writing after everyone else was asleep. My husband used to say, "You look tired, but your eyes are shining." He believed in me before anyone else did. That memory warmed me more than the tea. I heard footsteps behind me. It was my daughter-in-law. She looked tired. Her eyes were swollen, as if she had not slept much. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds before speaking. "Good morning," she said quietly. Her voice was not sharp, not mocking, just careful. "Good morning," I replied. There was an awkward pause, the kind that fills the room like fog. Then she walked closer and sat at the table. "I'm sorry," she said. Just 2 words, but they felt heavy. I did not answer right away. I wanted to understand what those words meant. "For what?" I asked gently. She lowered her eyes. "For laughing, for not asking, for not seeing you." Her voice trembled slightly, and in that moment, I saw something different in her. Not pride, not competition, just fear. She looked up at me. "I always thought you were just quiet. I didn't know there was so much inside you." I smiled softly. "There is so much inside all of us," I said. She nodded slowly. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of what?" I asked. She hesitated. "Afraid that I wasn't good enough. Afraid that you were better at everything. Afraid that the children loved you more." The words surprised me. I had never imagined that my presence made her feel small. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. I never wanted to compete with you, I said gently. You are their mother. That is something no one can replace. A tear slid down her cheek. I know that now, she said. The morning light was beginning to fill the kitchen. It softened everything, even our mistakes. Later that week, she asked me something unexpected. Would you help me with something? She said one afternoon. I was folding laundry in the living room. Of course, I replied. She sat down beside me. The school asked if I would organize the next reading event. I don't know where to start. I looked at her carefully. She was not asking for help because she had to. She was asking because she wanted to. And that made all the difference. We began planning together. Not as rivals. Not as strangers. But as two women who both loved the same children. We sat at the dining table with notebooks and pencils. We made lists. We talked about themes, about inviting parents, about creating a warm space where stories could breathe. At one point, she looked at me and said, You really love this, don't you? I nodded. Yes, I said softly. Stories saved me many times. She did not laugh this time. She listened. The next reading day arrived, but this time it felt different. She introduced me to the parents herself. This is my mother-in-law, she said proudly. She's the author of these books. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only respect. And something else. Gratitude. After the event, we walked home together. The children ran ahead, laughing and chasing each other. The air was cool. The trees swayed gently. I didn't understand before. She said quietly as we walked side by side. Understand what? I asked. That strength doesn't have to be loud. I smiled. Sometimes the quietest people have the longest stories, I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. At home, I went to my room and sat by the window. I thought about everything that had happened. The laughter, the humiliation, the silence, the apology. None of it felt wasted anymore. Pain, I realized, is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a teacher. It shows us where we are fragile. It shows us where we need to grow. That evening, my son knocked on my door. Mom, he said gently. Thank you. For what? I asked. For not leaving. For staying. For giving us time to understand. I looked at him for a long moment. I almost did leave, I admitted softly. He swallowed. I'm glad you didn't. So was I. Over the next few weeks. The atmosphere in the house slowly changed. Small things. She would ask for my opinion on dinner. I would ask her how her day went. We laughed more. Not loudly, but honestly. Trust does not return in one big moment. It returns in tiny pieces. A shared smile, a cup of tea placed quietly on the table, a door left open instead of closed. One afternoon, she came into my room holding one of my older books. I read this last night, she said. I waited. I didn't know you wrote about loneliness like that. I looked at the book in her hands. That was a difficult year, I said. She sat down on the edge of my bed. I think I understand you better now, she whispered. And I believed her. But forgiveness is not a straight line. There were still days when the memory of that laughter echoed inside me, when I would remember the look on her face at the school, the surprise, the disbelief. Sometimes, the hurt would return quietly, but instead of pushing it away, I let it pass through me, like rain. Temporary. Necessary. One evening, we were setting the table together. She paused and looked at me. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Why? Didn't you tell us you were the author? I took a deep breath. I didn't want it to matter, I said honestly. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for what I've done. She was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that, she said. It's all right, I replied gently. We are all learning. The children began asking me more about my stories. Grandma, did this really happen? Grandma, Is this character based on you? I answered their questions patiently, but I always added something important. Stories are not about the writer, I told them. They are about the heart. They did not fully understand yet. But one day, they would. Months passed. The house no longer felt divided. It felt shared. Not perfect, but honest. My daughter-in-law and I still had differences. We still disagreed sometimes, but there was no longer that invisible wall between us. Instead, there was space. Space to speak, space to listen, space to forgive. One afternoon, she brought me a small gift. It was a notebook. Simple, cream-colored. I thought you might need a new one, she said shyly. For what? I asked. For your next book. I held the notebook in my hands. It felt like more than paper. It felt like acceptance. Thank you, I whispered. And this time, when she smiled, there was no tension behind it, only warmth. That night, I sat at my desk. The house was quiet again. I opened the notebook. The pages were blank, but my heart was full. I began to write. Not about humiliation, not about revenge, but about growth. About how sometimes the people who hurt us are the ones who need healing the most. About how pride can hide fear. About how patience can soften even the hardest misunderstandings. As I wrote, I realized something. That day at the school was not the end of my dignity. It was the beginning of a deeper understanding. Not just for her, but for me. I learned that my worth does not need to be announced. It does not need applause. It does not shrink. When someone laughs. It remains steady, quiet, unshaken, and perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the most powerful response to humiliation is not anger. It is grace. Not weakness, but quiet strength, the kind that does not need to shout, the kind that simply stands and waits. As I closed the notebook, I felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest, and honesty, even when it hurts, is a bridge. It brings people back together. Slowly, gently, one conversation at a time. I did not lose my family that day at the school. I almost lost something else. My patience, my softness, my ability to see beyond pride. But I held on to it, and in doing so, I gained something more valuable than recognition. I gained understanding. When I turned off the light that night, I whispered a small prayer, not for success, not for praise, but for wisdom. Wisdom to stay calm when misunderstood, wisdom to speak kindly when hurt, wisdom to remember that every person carries hidden fears, even the ones who laugh. And in the darkness, I felt grateful. Grateful that I stayed. Grateful that she apologized. Grateful that love, when given time, can return. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The house was quiet that night. Even the children were asleep. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, holding a cup of tea that had grown cold outside. The wind whispered through the trees. Rain had left the leaves glistening. Everything seemed small and ordinary, and yet everything felt different. Because after all that had happened, I felt seen, truly seen. I thought about the day at school, the quiet classroom, the children's eyes, the teacher's gentle surprise, my grandson's proud look, and Emily's slow realization. All of it played softly in my mind. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about honesty, about letting the truth of who you are shine quietly, even when no one is watching. I thought about the moments I had spent hiding parts of myself, the hours spent writing while others assumed it was nothing, the times I smiled when I was really aching to be noticed. All those years, I thought shrinking would make life easier. I thought silence would keep the peace. But it only hid me. And sometimes, hiding hurts more than being seen. I realized something important. Life is not about proving yourself to anyone. It is about living in a way that feels honest, even if it means waiting for others to understand, even if it means being quiet while the world laughs, because your value does not come from applause. It comes from who you are when no one is watching. I glanced at the bookshelf across the room. 3 of my books stood neatly in front, visible. Finally, a small gesture, but it meant the world. Emily had arranged them there, not out of obligation, but out of respect, and I knew, in that moment, that things had shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but permanently. I thought about forgiveness, not just forgiving Emily, not just forgiving others, but forgiving myself for staying silent too long, for shrinking to fit in, for thinking my voice did not matter, because it did, and it always had. I sipped my tea slowly. The warmth spread through me, and I felt a quiet hope. Hope that my grandson would grow up seeing that courage is gentle. Hope that Emily would remember that understanding can come slowly. Hope that our family could move forward with respect and love. I thought about the shy little bird in my story, afraid to sing, afraid to be laughed at, and yet, eventually it did. Its voice was soft at first, uncertain, but steady, and the world listened. That bird was me, and in some ways, it was all of us. I placed my cup on the table. I opened a blank page in my notebook. I began to write again, not about apology, not about humiliation, but about life, about quiet courage, about hope that grows slowly, about love that waits patiently, even when it feels unrecognized. I thought about the lesson I wanted my grandson and everyone to remember. You do not need everyone's approval. You do not need constant recognition. You only need honesty. To yourself, and sometimes, that honesty is the bravest thing of all. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathed in deeply, breathed out slowly, and felt a peace I had not felt in years, because life had shown me that even after hurt, even after laughter at your expense, even after years of feeling small, you can still stand tall, calm, quietly strong. I whispered softly to the darkened room, be brave, speak softly, love honestly, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. And somewhere deep inside, I knew it was true. The shy bird had sung, and I had sung with her. The house was silent, but my heart was full.